All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Elections Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and this week we got a really good panel for you. We've got Johanna Rowland, Andrew Payne, Peter, and Joe Szymanski. We've got a great list of topics to go over. So we're going to start off the opening two segments we have. We're going to kind of split this into four blocks. So the first two segments we have are going to be on international politics. So Andrew has a lot of stuff to talk about with Ireland and Irish politics. And then Peter is going to kind of go over German and Canadian politics as well, if I recall right.
Yes.
And then we're going to have a brief little intermission in the middle. And then we're going to come back and go into the Tennessee Republican Senate primary, which is really shaping up to be a really competitive race. It's been surprisingly an interesting contest to look at. And then we're going to finish up with Joanna is going to help explain some of the COVID-19 stuff from kind of a more scientific perspective. And so definitely, if you have any questions, definitely submit them into the chat. We're going to talk, we have some questions lined up for her about that, but any additional ones we have, we'll go over. So I guess to start off, we'll kind of go to Andrew Payne, who's going to help explain some of the fundamentals of Irish politics, which are kind of interesting. For those who are unfamiliar with Ireland, there are several major political parties with interesting pronunciations and very tremendous names if you translate them into English. They have an interesting political system, so I'm going to kind of go ahead and throw it to him.
Hey, guys. So to understand Irish politics, you kind of have to go all the way back to the 1800s and understand that Ireland is a nation that was invaded by Britain, colonized by them, and then was malignantly neglected during the early 1800s, right up until a famine, at which point the British government started to get involved, which turned it into basically a genocide. The population of Ireland still has not recovered since the potato famine, and that led to the Gaelic revival that happened in the 1880s and 1890s, and led to the formation in the early 1900s of the party Sinn Féin, which translates to We Ourselves. They led the whole Irish nationalist movement during the 1920s and succeeded in ending the War of Independence that led to the Irish Free State. They then promptly split into two parties, Cumann Gael and Fianna Fáil, which represented the pro and anti-treaty side, and whether or not they wanted Ireland to be partitioned and whether or not they were okay with the peace treaty. Cumann Gael was pro-treaty, and they eventually turned into the political party Fine Gael, which currently exists today. Fianna Fáil was anti-treaty and wanted to have a complete republic that was not a dominion of the British. And Sinn Féin was still around. They were interested in still fighting the Irish War of Independence. And Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil basically were the two sides of the Irish Civil War. And that ended with the pro-treaty side winning. And Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael basically were the dominant political parties for the next 80 or so years of Irish politics. And for the most part, they're like Coke and Pepsi, same stuff, different can. Their only real difference is their stance on the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and that has not mattered since the 1920s. The real difference is their coalition. Fianna Fáil is strong in the rural areas. They're more agricultural focused. They're soft Eurosceptic, like very soft to the point where they're basically pro-European. And Fine Gael is stronger in the cities and are more business conservative instead of agricultural conservative. Mm-hmm. And Sinn Féin is the other party that we really care about in Irish politics. They are an ideological mess that ranges from David Cameron to Joseph Stalin, with the average member being around Jeremy Corbyn in ideology. Mm-hmm. Now, they had an election in February, which was a rout for Sinn Féin. They had their best popular vote total and seat numbers in decades. They got 37 seats out of 160. Fianna Fáil got 38 and Fine Gael got 35. And that led to a very interesting coalition problem. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael don't really like each other for historical reasons, but Sinn Féin has been blacklisted for basically their entire history in Irish politics, because historically, Sinn Féin has been the political arm of the IRA, which is a terrorist organization. And it's hard to understand how they cannot shake that off after the Good Friday Agreement. Like, the Troubles are over. They've been over since the late 90s. How have they not shaken that off? Why are they still like this? Well, since 1983 until 2018, they were led by Gerry Adams, who himself was a noted IRA member and terrorist. He's been implicated in multiple murders of informants to the British government. He was implicated in a bombing of Le Monde, which was a restaurant in Northern Ireland, and was all around just not the person you want actually leading the party if you want to shake off the idea that you are connected to the IRA. In 2018, he stepped down, and Mary Lou McDonald became the leader of Sinn Féin. And her move was to try to 100% move themselves away from the IRA. And she was mostly successful by reaching out to younger left-wing people. Like, Good Friday Agreement was in 98. A lot of people who are younger than 30 do not have any memories of the Troubles at all and don't really have the baggage involved. And that was successful. It led to them to their largest popular vote and largest seat total in decades. The problem is, in the victory parties, many of the members who were elected were caught on camera saying phrases like Choki Farla, which literally translates to "our time will come," which has the same connotation in Ireland that the phrase "the South will rise again" has in America. And that basically said that, yeah, they truly have not reformed. They might have a different label, but they haven't really reformed. And so they basically went through 4 months of negotiations on how the government was going to be set up. And it ended with Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and the Greens coming together for a coalition where Michael Martin, the leader of the Fianna Fáil, became Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of Ireland, and Leo Varadkar, the leader of Fine Gael, became Tánaiste, or Deputy Prime Minister, and they split most of the ministries. Now, the Greens got environment, obviously, tourism, and children with disability as their ministerships. Now, it's been a month since the coalition has basically been created, and it's already starting to collapse. Not only do Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil not really like each other, but Fianna Fáil is starting to have internal problems, starting with their controversial pick for agricultural secretary, Barry Cohen. He is the incompetent brother of former Taoiseach Brian Cohen, and he was not liked by half of the party. And he was basically put in the position just as an olive branch. The Cohens within the party, they're influential in a certain province and they need representation. Then he gets a DUI and is ceremoniously kicked out of government. And that angered that wing of the party, and he was replaced by Dara Calloway, which was a responsible move, is someone immensely qualified, but it didn't really help with either Cohen's wing or the wing that didn't believe Cohen had any reason to be in government to begin with. So they're starting to fragment there, and when angry people in Irish government start getting upset, they have a tendency to go independent. There are currently 12 to 14 independents in the Dáil Éireann right now, depending on how you count parties with single members. And more notably, today, the government lost a vote for the Lás Congola, which is the deputy speaker of the House. This was a surprising result. They thought they had it in the bag, but the opposition candidate won, which means someone in the coalition voted for the opposition candidate. And basically, they have no idea who it is because it was a secret ballot. And it's breaking the trust of the coalition because This is something as simple as who is Speaker of the House, or Speaker of the Parliament. And if you can't trust them for a vote like that, which doesn't really have that much power, how can you trust them for a budgetary thing or a major bill that could lead to the collapse of the government? So the coalition is not stable right now at all.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting look into it. And just for our viewers who may be a little bit less acquainted with Irish politics, I'm going to pull up the political compass, how they rank the Ireland. Now, just as a warning, the political compass, the people who run that site skew to the left politically. I don't think it's unfair to say that. And so really you could move all of these rankings about 3 to 5 points to the left, because their center is basically social democracy is the center of the political system. So it looks like Sinn Féin is further towards the center than they actually are. In practice, they're a very more they're definitely a party of the left. So you'll notice, as you said before, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, Fine Gael are both, they're both to the right politically. You also have Labour, who are the historic partners of Fine Gael. They've usually been involved in coalitions when they're in government, although I believe they had a pretty poor showing at the last election.
They're a party now.
Yeah. And the irony there is that Fine Gael is typically seen as the further right of the two parties, but they've always had to coalition with Labour, who are definitely not a party of the right. They're an opportunistic party. And then you'll notice you have a bunch of these minor parties over here. You have the Greens, and then you have Sinn Féin. So keep in mind, these probably should go about 3 to 5 points to the left, all of them, because really neither of these two parties are very extreme, and they're very similar in terms of most policy positions. So I guess my question for you is, why are these two parties still so opposed to each other when so many younger voters are willing to turn their backs on, kind of the historic, we don't vote for Sinn Féin because they're terrorists? Why can't they do the same thing with these two parties when the only real difference seems to be my grandparents fought on one side or the other?
I would say it's mainly because of political inertia, and to a certain extent, the parties are relatively segregated, with Fine Gael being in the cities and Fianna Fáil being in the rural areas. They don't really cross paths, and they're strong in their strongholds.
Mm-hmm. So where did Sinn Féin start picking up seats in? Was this just all over the country, or was it concentrated in certain portions?
Mainly in Dublin and along the Northern Ireland border.
Mm-hmm. So they were picking off communities that are more invested in the concept of Irish reunification.
Pretty much. Multiple counties in Ireland were split during the partition. And so there are a lot of counties in Northern Ireland and on the border that do not make sense at all.
Yeah, because that was generally an ethnic split to provide the Protestant minority in the north to keep them a part of the United Kingdom. I won't go too much into the weeds on whether or not that was the right decision or not, but that was the decision that was made, and that's the one that people have to live with at the moment. Mm-hmm. And so I believe Peter had a question about Martin.
Yes, with Micheál Martin. There's been lots of rumors in the Irish press that his party has been very unhappy with him for some time, and threats of leadership challenges. Do you think there's any chance that he may very well be challenged internally by someone?
100%. Probably in the upcoming election, if he loses confidence of the Dáil Éireann, he will probably be challenged for leadership. But at the moment, they're just trying to weather the storm and keep the coalition afloat, because looking at the current election polls, they don't want to go to an election right now. It would wipe their party out. And he doesn't have any, he's not the Teflon Taoiseach that Bertie Ahern was. He just keeps stepping in it and has not necessarily done good in electoral results.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess this kind of leads into another question, which is, for most of Irish history, Fianna Fáil has been the most, Fianna Fáil has been the most popular party. It's kind of been like in Japan, where you've had the majority party has governed for pretty much most of the history, with brief periods in between of rule from Fine Gael. What made Fianna Fáil decline so rapidly from the previous position?
I would say half of it's just the coalition. Not only do they have the kicking out of the agriculture secretary, which was very out there in the news, they also have the fact that they went into a coalition with Fine Gael in the first place, and then dragged the Greens into it in a blatantly anyone but Sinn Féin coalition. And to young people, that's not a good thing. They don't have any connections to the terrorist origins of Sinn Féin at all. They don't have any memories of the Troubles. So they don't see like that as a good thing. They just see it as, hey, you're just blackballing a party out of Parliament, even though they got the most votes and the second most seats.
Mm-hmm. Were Sinn Féin willing to work with anyone, or were they?
They were willing to work with the Greens and a bunch of independents, but they didn't necessarily have the numbers to create a working majority. They would have required confidence supply from either Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil.
So they were hoping for a minority government.
Pretty much.
On the point you mentioned about Fianna Fáil's decline, wouldn't another viewpoint of their decline also take place that they were the last government during the crash, and a lot of the mistakes made of Ireland's monetary standing were caused because of reckless decisions from them?
Oh, yeah. Barry Cohen's brother, Brian Cohen, was former Taoiseach. He was the actual Taoiseach during the crash. He left government in 2011 with an 8% approval rating. He was essentially Ireland's George Bush. And that has essentially been forgotten. The party that really got killed in the crash was the Labour Party. And generally, another thing that's really killing them right now is just the coronavirus. Ireland is doing good, but not doing good at the same time. They don't have as many cases as a lot of European countries, but the government is slow walking certain necessary things like shutting down ports and monitoring airplanes, closing schools, and things like that.
Definitely. So what would you are the polls showing anything right now at the moment? So, for example, if this coalition were to implode and they had to go to another election, what are the polls kind of indicating right now?
So the polls right now are showing a Fine Gael romp, 38%, which would lead to 60 seats. And you need 80 to form a government. Most of that coming at the expense of Fianna Fáil, who are now about 12%, and Sinn Féin staying pat at about 25, 26%. Mm-hmm. And remember, in the last election in February, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and Sinn Féin all got around 25% each. So that is a big change.
Mm-hmm. And so that would leave them, of course, 12 seats short of a majority if that were the case. Would they be working with, has Labour shown any rebound, or would they be having to work with, a significantly weakened Fianna Fáil, or?
Fine Gael would probably either lead a minority government propped up by Fianna Fáil, or they would get either the Greens or any number of independents to side with them.
Mm-hmm. And Sinn Féin would, of course, be locked out of power. They would not be in a position to have much influence.
Yeah. The thing that parties have to start looking out for is when Sinn Féin starts getting, say, 30%, and you have to work with them in order to form a government.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that their policies, that that it had been kind of exposed that they hadn't significantly moderated to the same degree. I know Mary Lou McDonald tried to present herself as more of a moderate, but even herself had been caught up with some sort of scandals revolving around, for example, telling I believe she was caught with a sign that said something along the lines of "English get out," which isn't necessarily in the spirit of reunification, considering many people who live in Northern Ireland strongly identify with with English ancestry. Has that played a part as well, or have they just kind of is that what's kind of stopped their rise, or are they kind of maxed out already?
I think what stopped the rise is the fact that demographics have not changed at all since February. 25% that they got is still 25% they have now, and they're going to have to wait for the Troubles to be further gone, more people who have direct ties with the IRA to not be involved with the party. And the problem is she has to make sure that she's not basically kicked out for a backbencher who is 100% a clone of Gary Adams. Because that is still a large constituency. She has to walk the tightrope.
Mm-hmm. So are they having to wait until some of the older members of that party kind of die off, and are they able to become more of a standard, sort of more of a left-wing, a typical left-wing, nationalist party, closer to the lines you get in places like, Barcelona or other, the Scottish National Party, places along that lines where they're not necessarily known for bigotry or terrorism, just for typical left-wing policies combined with a focus on some sort of nationalist issue.
That's what she's trying to turn the party into, but you have to wait like 10 to 20 years for all of the old timers to either retire or lose election. And that's not happening right now. It is going to be a slow process, and they're trying to rebrand themselves. And for older members of the electorate, that's not going to work at all. But for the younger members of the electorate, it's been successful.
Mm-hmm. Because traditionally Ireland has been dominated by right-of-center parties. You also had during the early 90s and the early 2000s, there was a minor party, a very liberal conservative party with a very big emphasis on neoliberal free market economics that played a major role in the policy there. So the policy was either controlled by people who were right of center or people who were very right of center. Now they're being presented, a more electable, if you want to call it that, left-wing alternative that's at least been able to get a portion of the vote.
Part of the reason why Varadkar's government lost seats in the 2020 election was because they couldn't deal with the housing crisis in Dublin. They didn't support social housing. There wasn't enough private investment because of NIMBYs. It was just not good. Basically, Dublin is San Francisco in Ireland.
And of course, that's one of the two big cities, and aside from you have Belfast and Northern Ireland. That's still a lot of rural areas, a lot of not as religiously conservative as it once was, obviously, but a very interesting country with a very interesting culture and specifically names. I love their party names, like Soldiers of Destiny. That's an awesome party name. I mean,
Exactly.
You can't get a whole lot better than that.
All right, really can't.
Yeah. So I think that kind of puts a good place to move on from the Ireland discussion. Really good information. Definitely can look up some more about Irish politics if you're interested. It's a very interesting country. They have a unique voting system, and as it becomes more of a multi-party system, there's going to be some more interesting coalitions like this. So now we're going to move on to Peter, who is going to talk about two other European countries. Germany and Canada. They both have elections for two of their major political parties' leadership positions, also on the more political right side of the perspective. Obviously, I didn't mean to say Canada was European, but it may as well be an attitude, right? Yes. But
they act like Europeans anyway.
Yeah,
so.
Britain thinks they're an island in the middle of the Mid-Atlantic, and Canada thinks they're on the border of Europe. So. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the candidates for the German leadership race. This is for the Christian Democratic Union, one of the major, one of the major. Actually, that's Canada. Here we go.
That's it.
Yeah. No, I had the wrong one pulled up on my screen. But so the Christian Democratic Union. What do we need to know about them as a party?
So the CDU was arguably one of the most successful parties in the world since the return of German democracy after World War II. They've been in government for almost 55 out of the last 75 years. The thing with them is that arguably this leadership is really more about party identity. So Angela Merkel was party leader till 2018. The current prime minister, the current chancellor of Germany, I should say. She retired because of internal pressure and was replaced by Angeret Cunningham, who was a loyalist of Angela, defeating Friedrich Merz, who I'll explain, who has a lovely backstory with Mrs. Merkel. She won that. However, in the 2 years she held the job, it was a poison chalice. She couldn't get the results off of the party. They were doing terrible across the board in local, regional elections, and the party's support nationally was dwindling. And finally, Mrs. Kronbauer came into pressure from the party to resign her position. So now we have this leadership contest. This was supposed to be decided in May, but thanks to COVID, everything got pushed back. So they will have to determine whom and when will have this contest. So the three candidates running are quite interesting. So you have Admin Lasek, I'm probably bombing that. He is the minister president of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is one of the most populous region in Germany. One of the most populous region in Germany. He is a very close supporter of Mrs. Merkel in terms of ideology. He has the vision she has, a very much pragmatic, conservatism, which is, being more government involvement, but also respect for tradition. So that's Mr. Lasek. Mr. Merz is a bit of an old timer. He's much more the classic right winger that the CDU historically has preferred. He was a long-standing rival of Mrs. Merkel back in the early 2000s when the leadership of the party was very much wide open. Since then, he was the leader of the CSU group in the Bundestag, but later was removed from that role when Mrs. Merkel seized power in the CDU. For the last decade and a half, he's been a director at the Atlantic Council and also at Blackstone. So he's very much a business-friendly oriented guy, very pro-American, very critical of Russia and China, especially with the Russian part being that the Nord Stream gas line is in Germany. And then finally, there's Norbert Röttgen. Norbert Röttgen is also from the same region as Erin Lasek and Mr. Merz. He was a former environmental minister under Mrs. Merkel from 2009 to 2012. He then ran for the minister president of West Rhine-Westphalia. He lost that badly and was later fired from his cabinet job because of that performance. And since 2014 led the Bundestag Foreign Affairs Committee, also like Mr. Merz, very critical of Russia and China and very pro-American and pro-European in his mindset. The race itself has been seen as a two-horse race between Mr. Lasek and Mr. Merz. Mr. Lasek has been seen as the favorite. However, in the last few weeks, he's made some gaffes in terms of his COVID handling. He referred to saying that Romanians and Poles were causing Germany's COVID problem and that they were to use not rats. So that is, what led to condemnation for many different sectors of Germany. And Mr. Merz has arguably run a very quiet campaign, but that might be to his advantage since he really is the challenger of a different era. Mrs. Merkel obviously is very popular at the time being with her response to the COVID crisis. So it will be interesting to see, how this all plays out in the leadership of the CDU, which is a very important job. It's a job you're expected to do well and win. And there's a very good chance that one of these three gentlemen could be the next chancellor of Germany, though that in recent days has also become a bit questionable because of the emergence of the leader of the CSU, the Christian Social Union Party of Bavaria, which is their coalition partner, leader's handling of the crisis. Markus Söder, who is the minister president of Bavaria, has done very well in his COVID handling. He has had the highest approval rating in all of Germany, considered the best local response, not just in Germany, but in Europe. And there have been many rumors in the German media that Mr. Söder may actually take the full chancellorship role instead of one of these three gentlemen, which would be historic. CSU has only been given the top spot twice and have failed at both attempts. So this would be their best attempt of having a Bavarian possibly leading Germany.
Definitely. So I'm going to start off kind of the discussion with Joe, who had a question regarding Angela Merkel's support.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So who does Merkel exactly support, if out of these three candidates, if she really supports anyone? Because she's kind of taken this huge, very productive role as German chancellor in this modern era. So who does she see as the best to kind of continue that and to continue this expansion of German power internationally in the modern age?
So yeah, I think she would be much more happy with Mr. Advent Lasek. I think they're closer politically. Merz for her would be a nightmare, as those two have bad blood, and for Merz it would be mostly a very sweet revenge to destroy the Merkel legacy in terms of how she's run the party. So yeah, I would say Laxet. She's very popular right now for her handling, so it could be interesting if she decides to get if she does play a role. She said herself that she doesn't have no intention of being involved in this contest, but I would suspect that if she had to choose a preferred person to succeed her as chancellor, it would probably be Mr. Laxet.
Mm-hmm. And I have a question as well, which is specifically, you mentioned Friedrich Merz is more supportive of American involvement, is more supportive of Americans. Would you say that he's the candidate, if you're the president, whether or not you're Donald Trump or Joe Biden or not, is he the one that you're wanting to win because he'd be more interested in open ties and kind of distancing from Russia?
Yes, Mr. Merz is very much, has had a very hawkish view. He wants more American troops in Germany. He wants more German spending on defense, and wants a tougher Western response to both Russia and China. So in an American sense, Mr. Merz or even Mr. Rogden would be perfect candidates for U.S. interests in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Even under a Biden administration, would you say he'd be...
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Mr. Merz has a very pro-American view, and I'm sure under a Biden or even a Trump second term, that would be very much a welcome relief in Washington.
Mm-hmm. And one other question I have as well, which is you mentioned the Christian Social Union, which is the rather than running in Bavaria, the Christian Democratic Union instead partners with the Christian Social Union. That kind of reminds me of kind of the dynamic in Australia, where you have the Nationals and you have the Liberals, which is the same sort of situation. You have a dominant party and then you have a local party. You mentioned the possibility of the leader of the Christian Social Union having an influence. Would you say that would they be okay basically with any of these candidates winning, or is there a candidate they would prefer out of the bunch?
I don't think they have a preference against who wins it. I think the CSU will have better relations with whoever wins with in this case. Mrs. Merkel has had very strenuous relations in the past with her junior coalition partners in the right. Mr. Soder's predecessor, Hofnat Schlender, was very critical of Merkel when he was the leader in charge. He's now her interior minister. That tells you all you need to know sometimes about German politics. But yeah, no, I think they don't really mind. But as mentioned, their leader has been very popular, and could be a chance where one of those, whoever wins that, the CDU may decide to defer the top chancellor spot, running in 21 to Soder, who is very much popular and very much an effective, register president. The interesting thing about Soder is that he was a populist, when he took the job, very, right-wing populist. And since he's been the minister president, he's shifted. He's become this green-friendly conservative who cares, about people, very compassionate conservative. So in Soder's case, he's very much maneuvered himself into a possibility of getting a prize that no Bavarian has ever gotten in Germany, which is to be the leader in charge of the country.
And that's fascinating because traditionally the Christian Social Union, they're considered the more right-wing of the two parties, but that's mainly because of their stances on social issues. Yes. They're much more in line with not only social issues, but Catholic social teaching, which can obviously be a tricky issue if you're not a Catholic. So you're saying Soder would be much more amenable to the rest of Germany at this point as someone more in line with what they'd be willing to elect.
Yeah, and he's, on that point with religion, he's very much, done very odd things you wouldn't expect from a CSU leader. He said he's pro-gay marriage. He said he has no issue with it whatsoever. He's marched in gay pride parades in Munich. But he also has that cultural conservative of preserving German culture. So he plays a very interesting balancing effect, if there's to say it, in his politics.
Would any of them, if they were elected leader, work with AFD?
No. That has been one of the big lines. None of the three want to work with the AFD. However, Mr. Merz has been somewhat critical in saying that a good chunk of AFD voters are former CDU voters, which the data does back up. So his argument is that the party needs to, and this might not be the most politically nice way of saying it, regain some of those voters' trusts, which is by embracing more, right-wing views on immigration, which has been a very controversial topic in Germany since the 2015 refugee saga, which Mrs. Merkel let in many refugees to the annoyance of her own party and many across Germany. So I don't think they want to work with them, but I think a lot of them are realistic of the fact that they will need to win back some of those AFD voters if they want to put the CDU/CSU coalition in a good position to form the next government of Germany in 2021. And the interesting part about that is that they may very well, like in Austria, have to go into government with the Greens, which would be a very interesting effect to see a conservative party and a Green party in the same tent.
The blue-green coalition, or in Germany it would be the black-green coalition, because Germany, their parties are in theory conservative, but they're generally associated with Christian democracy, as the title suggests, which they use an alternative color. Just the feature. For those who aren't familiar with AFD, they're the Alternative for Germany party. They started out as a fairly typical, more right of center party, more interested in some sort of specific economic issues, generally populist. And then they've gradually morphed into a very right-wing populist, bordering on far right, with some elements that are unseemly in terms of racism, very anti-Islam, immigration, and even some elements that can be linked to neo-Nazism, which is obviously a very touchy subject in Germany. So they're generally considered very toxic, even though they do have a reasonable portion of the electorate at this point.
Have any of the people running ruled out another grand coalition?
They haven't gone that far, but I think the conventional view in Germany is that the Social Democrats, Social Democratic Party of Germany, the partner currently in the Grand Coalition, really doesn't want to have another coalition with the CDU, because especially it's eating really into their support with the Greens, as the Greens have really gotten a lot of disinfected former Social Democrat voters who feel as if the coalition is not what they wanted. I mean, and I can understand that. If you're a person of the left, you do not want your party to go into cahoots, pumping up a government of the right. So I think, I don't think they've been against it, but I think it's more or less maybe that the Social Democrats decide more or less to opt out in 21 and instead, maybe decide to, if they have the numbers, go into government with the Greens and the left, another party in Germany, the left party. But yeah, I think there's a very high chance if there is a CDU government, it's going to be with the Greens, and if there is a Green government, it will be with the Social Democrats.
Definitely, I say this a lot. It's definitely a race to keep an eye on, right? I mean, given the party is so dominant historically in Germany, it's really important as to the future of the country, who the next prime minister or who the next chancellor will be. And it's very likely that this, if not, if it's not very likely, it's very possible that one of those three individuals will be the next chancellor of Germany. We also had one other party we were going to go over, which is the Conservative Party of Canada. They're kind of reeling from their election defeat in the previous Canadian election, although they won more votes than the Liberal Party by a small margin. They were defeated in terms of a government overall, and Trudeau has managed to keep a control of government there. And so they're trying to figure out the best approach with which to challenge Trudeau after the previous candidate for prime minister was generally seen as ineffective in a lot of different ways. So they're doing some serious soul searching, and they've currently are having their election as well. For Americans, this may be an unusual concept of having an election like this, one specific election where everyone votes for the party leader, as opposed to what we do it, where you have this gigantic, long, drawn-out thing. They just do it all do it all like this, and only party members are allowed to vote, which is a distinguishing feature that we do not have, considering a lot of states don't even register by party, let alone you pay dues to a party. So these are the nominees, and just kind of give us a little bit of information about each of the nominees here on the list.
All right, so to understand this contest, you have to go a little back with Tory party history, the rights history in Canada. So for many decades, the Conservative Party in Canada were called the Progressive Conservatives. And they were not very successful, but in the 80s under Brian Mulroney, they got power, but their coalition was very unstable. Their coalition was Quebec nationalists, Westerners, people in Ontario, and people in the Atlantic. That coalition couldn't last forever. So it inevitably blew up. And with that came the creation of another center-right party called the Reform Party, which was very Western Canadian light. The two throughout the 90s into the early 2000s were competing against each other for the same block of voters, center-right voters. The Progressive Conservatives were wiped out in 1993. There's a lovely map of Kim Campbell, who led her party from 156 seats down to a lovely number of 2. So that led to a lovely decade of recriminations between the two parties, splitting their vote, letting the Liberals in. So this is where one Peter MacKay gets involved in this conversation. Peter MacKay was the last leader of the Progressive Conservatives. In the mid-2000s, he decided, and breaking a campaign promise he'd made it in the PC leadership, to merge his party with the Canadian Alliance Party. Reform had renamed itself. He and Stephen Harper, who later became Prime Minister of Canada, merged the two parties into the Tory party, the Conservative Party. And Mr. MacKay was his deputy up until his retirement in 2015. So now to the actual contest itself. So this contest, Peter MacKay is very much what we would say is a liberal Tory, very, socially tolerant, physically conservative. His father was a Tory minister in the 80s under Mulroney. And he's more of, let's, go with the safe route option. He's more, let's move the party away from controversial social issues, which has been a very big magnet in the Tory party for some time, as abortion is very controversial in the party, just like in the GOP. However, the average Canadian isn't very strong about the issue, so it's a balancing act. So Mr. MacKay is right now the front runner, but the other person who's right on his tail is Aaron O'Toole. Mr. O'Toole is from Ontario, and Mr. MacKay is originally from the Atlantic. Mr. O'Toole is a former military veteran who got into Parliament about a decade ago, was a minister under Stephen Harper as well, and was a foreign affairs critic under Andrew Scheer. He's running more of a traditional, right-wingish campaign, blue Tory. I'm not afraid to say he's a social conservative, saying that he's proud of his values and he doesn't want to move to the moderate middle. So that's Mr. O'Toole, much more conservative. The other two are a little more. So Lessa Lewis really came out of nowhere. No one really knew who she was. She's a lawyer, also from Ontario. She's run more of a libertarianish race in her views. And she's been rather, interesting as a candidate. She won't win the contest, but there's a very good chance if she does well, she may be given a good seat in the Ontario area. On that also subject of Ontario, Mr. Sloan also is from Ontario. All the candidates are from the East, which will be a historic first for the Tories, as all the previous leaders under the United Party have all been from the West. Mr. Sloan is much more right-wingish, to the point of, I would say, even extreme right. So he's very controversial, very right-wingish, and probably going to finish dead last. But the key in this is going to be transfer votes, since you need 50 plus 1 to win this contest. So if you're Peter MacKay, you really need a good, strong first performance so you can get transfer votes to get you over 50%. If you're Aaron O'Toole, you really need to keep Peter MacKay arguably under 40-ish% to be in contention. The big key in this is that the previous leader, Andrew Scheer, ran into problems with voters in Ontario over his social conservative views when he said on an election program that he would not march in a pride parade when asked the question, and many believe that was the moment he ran himself into trouble. Additionally, with also a crappy French language debate in Quebec also did him in. So the party now is trying to find basically the right voice it can take to the Canadian people.
All right, so let's kind of start with the questions here. I believe Andrew had to start one off on the most crucial question in Canada, in fact, some for leadership. And I'm not exaggerating. It's a very important issue that
it is.
Conservatives run into lately.
Yeah. Do any of the candidates running for leadership not speak French?
So 3 of the 4 do speak French. The one who has had the French issue problem over the years is one Peter MacKay, the front runner. MacKay, French is rather crappy. He basically, I like to mock people with their languages, but basically speaks a ramble of English and French sometimes combined into one. So yeah, his French isn't really great, which of course is a very concerning aspect for some Tories in Quebec, of not having a leader who speaks French decently. Should be noted that Stephen Harper really didn't speak French well, but took lessons before, and it improved his French very well. So it's not, I think French voters aren't against people who maybe don't speak it well, but they want someone who actually looks like they're trying. But yeah, MacKay is the only one who really has a language barrier as we speak right now.
Mm-hmm. And so I'll ask another question here, which is obviously last time you had a very close contest between Andrew Scheer and Maxime Bernier, who later went on to found his own party, which proceeded to do basically nothing aside from steal some votes from some Tories
and he
in competitive districts. Yeah, and he lost. He had the opposite issue, of course, which is that his English was not very good.
Yes.
He's from Quebec and he speaks French very well, obviously, but he had issues with English. So the way you seem to mention it is that 3 of the 4 candidates seem to be running a more conservative campaign, and MacKay is running a more moderate campaign. Yes. Is that the way I kind of heard it right? Because, like, for example, Leslyn Lewis and Derek Sloan have obviously, they both run into issue over their opposition to bans on conversion therapy, which is a difficult issue in the States. People don't want to be on the bad side on that, let alone in Canada.
Correct. And Mr. MacKay himself has pretty much taken very liberal positions on these social issues. He's trying to not get into the trap that arguably Andrew Scheer ran into, which was being against the norms of arguably what is in the critical GTA area where Canadian elections are decided.
Because obviously, if you look at the previous election, which is kind of more typical of previous Canadian elections, right, where the Conservatives did very well out in the West, won there by a substantial margin, but out in the East, is in Ontario and Quebec in particular, they did very poorly.
Yeah.
So they're trying to reverse that this time. And I believe Joe has one more question here about as well.
Yeah, so obviously, as we look over the candidates, obviously you mentioned that Peter MacKay is the favorite in this race. But obviously, you saw he does not currently have a seat in Parliament.
Correct.
So if MacKay wins the leadership election, who leads the party in the House, in Canada's House at that point? Who leads the party since MacKay himself does not have a seat?
So that's an interesting question. In his case, Peter MacKay would have to find a seat. Probably my guess is that someone would quit their seat to give him the seat. And the tradition of Canadian politics is that if there's the leader of the opposition is entering the House, the other parties do not stand. So if tradition holds, liberals would not run against him. But on the terms of who would lead in the House, that's become an interesting question because there's been accusations, a lot by Aaron O'Toole's people, that McKay is basically bribing people for endorsements in the fact that they would be given front row ability to speak for the party while McKay gets his seat. The former deputy leader of the party under Andrew Scheer, who just resigned to support Mr. McKay, has been rumored to maybe be the person who could get it. She, of course, is a former liberal, which would be quite interesting. She defected. It's Lenioff Asloff, who's a former liberal. That's one name who could get it. Woman, which would be very beneficial maybe for the Tories. The other name is who was going to run in this contest but decided at the last minute not to run, is Pierre Poilievre. Very much an attack dog. Very much seen as someone who gives Trudeau a lot of problems in the chamber himself. So there's a good chance Poilievre could be the one who gets the job in the chamber until Mr. McKay is given a seat. Probably, assuming Mr. McKay will get a seat somewhere in Ontario. And for that time being, whoever holds that seat will speak for the party. And once Mr. McKay gets that in, that person will probably be given a front bench role in a different capacity.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So, and the election will be held on the 21st of August, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the transfer votes that's the one to keep an eye on. If nobody gets over 50%, you'll see some substantial problems underneath and how the votes
absolutely. And to wrap this up, Mr. In the terms of Justin Trudeau is very popular for his corona outbreak, since that's the man they want to beat. However, in recent weeks, Mr. Trudeau has run into another controversial scandal. He didn't tell the ethics commissioner that a charity he supported giving money to at a cabinet meeting was paying him for events. So that's now become a big story in the Canadian press about Trudeau's ethics, which would arguably be the third major scandal involving Trudeau's lack of judgment on things. First being the SNC Lavalin affair and blackface.
Mm-hmm. So definitely, we'll keep you updated, of course, on Elections Daily when the results come in. But right now, we're going to go ahead and take a quick break for a minute to let us kind of stretch our legs out. We'll be back here in a minute, and we'll be starting up on the second half of our discussion, which will be revolving around COVID-19 as well as some of the races in Tennessee's Republican side. So we'll be right back. There we go. All right, so we are back, and we're going to go into our next segment, which is about the COVID-19. Joanna has a unique perspective on this. She works in the sciences, so has a pretty good knowledge on some of this stuff, and we've got some good questions ready for her regarding COVID-19. So we're going to go ahead and start off on that. So I'm just going off the ones you mentioned in the chat. Specifically, if you have any additional ones or additional comments, definitely go forward. We're going to try to debunk some of the misstatements that have been going around recently. So some people on social media have been claiming that wearing a mask raises CO2 levels. Is that the case? And if not, why is it not the case?
That is not the case, Eric. Actually, there was a car accident in New Jersey back in April, and a man was wearing his N95 mask for some reason while driving. I don't know what his reasoning would have been behind that, but he crashed, and he told the authorities, I was wearing my N95 mask for hours, and I passed out. And they found upon inspection that that was not the case. And a lot of people think that the regular surgical masks that you see people wearing cause you to retain carbon dioxide. The actual name for that is hypercapnia. That's the scientific name for carbon dioxide retention. And the reason that you don't retain carbon dioxide when you have on a regular surgical mask is because the air is able to pass in and out. The mask is designed to capture larger molecules, molecules that have virus in them, spit, respirations. And the CO2 molecules are a lot smaller, so they can just easily pass through the barrier, whereas larger molecules cannot. So that's the reason why you don't retain, and if you wear one of these masks, obviously you've got air coming out the sides, it should be worn down to below your chin so it's fitted. That's one reason that, the CDC has told men to shave beards. Facial hair is part of a problem with proper fitting of masks. The mask should fit, tightly over your nose and come down below your chin, but you still have these pockets on the side, that also allow for proper respiration. But, molecules of oxygen and carbon dioxide can freely pass through the barrier, whereas droplets cannot. Most droplets cannot. Some still get through. That's one reason that, it's better for, someone who's infected to have a mask on and someone who is not infected to have a mask on when social distancing isn't possible. And, in a store, in an enclosed area, that's where we really need them, because people will come into close contact. And, it's kind of like when the World Health Organization said, COVID-19 might be airborne. And everyone goes, we've known that for months. They they didn't mean, that all of a sudden they had figured out that it was airborne. They figured out that droplets hung in the air in an enclosed space for a longer period of time. And that made masks even more important. And so that's part of the misunderstanding, is the difference between droplets and actual respiration molecules. So
and obviously there are people who wear masks every day, all day, as part of their jobs,
exactly.
Which are kind of, and I've actually seen videos of people who have like doctors having an oxygen test,
Yes.
putting it on their thumb and then putting the mask on, and it doesn't even shift at all.
Yes.
So definitely, definitely that's something that's been going around, that's misinformation that doesn't really fit with the science, what actually happens in reality. Another one that's been coming up recently, and I know there's some people who, I've seen this on Facebook myself, is Brad Parscale, the former Trump campaign manager, who has now been demoted to, I believe, digital manager or something along that line, claimed today that there was a fatal shooting that was labeled as a COVID death. Is that the case?
I don't know. I can't speak to the particular case that he's referencing. He says he spoke to a police officer, and the police officer told him. But I do know that CDC guidelines have been issued for clinicians, which are usually medical examiners in this case, to properly conduct examinations and label a death to the best of their ability if testing is not possible. And, in the case of a shooting, I find it really hard to believe that someone was shot and then tested and they said, oh, this is a COVID-19 death. More likely, what would have happened in that sort of case would have been the person was shot, got to the hospital, would have recovered from the shooting, but they had COVID-19 and spent probably some time in the hospital, but died as a result of the virus.
Because you can die from multiple things. It's not like you just have to die from only one thing.
Right. And I looked into this and, how it's listed with people who have pre-existing conditions like diabetes, COPD, things like that. COVID-19 is listed as the primary cause of death, with, diabetes or ARDS, something like that. ARDS, I think, is listed primary, and then COVID-19 would be secondary. But in the case of like diabetes or COPD, you would have COVID-19 listed as the primary cause of death, with, diabetes being secondary, or COPD being secondary to the cause of death. And medical examiners have so many tools at their disposal. If someone comes in who has, who has died in their home and they've been there several days, if testing is not possible, they can stick them, in a CT scan, they can stick them in an MRI, they can take chest x-rays and look for the ground glass opacity, in their lungs, and they can tell if someone has COVID-19, from the presentation of the body. So, a lot of these stories about someone told me this or that or whatever, it's just anti-science in a lot of cases, and it's fear mongering, and it's just rumor spreading. There's no one out to exaggerate or under-report these deaths. It is what it is. Americans need to realize and need to know, the deaths that COVID-19 is causing in their communities.
Definitely. And so we're going to, Andrew, I believe, has a question as well.
Okay.
Another question about the masks in particular.
Okay.
Oops, I believe he is muted.
There we go.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, that's Peter. My bad. Peter.
It's fine. On the question of the masks, there's a lot of people on social media who are referencing what was said in February and March about the masks shouldn't be used, they aren't effective. How can you respond to that with telling them that obviously the science on that has changed?
I believe originally, especially in the case of N95 masks and surgical masks. I don't know if you ever went on Amazon back then and tried to order some masks. I did. And they were outrageously priced. There was a huge shortage of masks during that time. And I think really what happened was, healthcare workers needed the masks and they were trying to conserve the masks. And so the public was told, stay at home, isolate, and only go out if you have to, socially distance. And as far as masks not being needed, I think that was just something that, we were told to conserve masks for healthcare workers. And I also think with this new information about droplets and some of the things that they have found, in different places where you've had large groups, spread among large groups, they've found that, we do in fact need masks along with distancing in enclosed spaces. And also things like funerals. You've had a lot of people infected at funerals. So I think that, just we've learned science is always evolving. We're always learning more. This was a novel virus. We don't know anything about it. What we know, we've had to learn in a very short period of time. Things are likely to change again, and again and again. So, I think it was probably a variety of reasons, but the big takeaway is we're learning, and it's going to take time.
Mm-hmm. And so definitely. So I guess we'll go on to the Tennessee stuff in a second here. But if you had to, I guess just say one other thing about towards this, what places would you say people should avoid at the moment, in particular?
I would avoid bars. I would avoid any area. There was significant spread early on at a church choir practice because you had, of course, people in a confined space singing. And there's I think it's the 20-80 rule. 20% of people are super spreaders, 20% of people contribute to about 80% of infections that we see. So I think that, bars, for obvious reasons, any enclosed area where people are going to be singing or vocalizing loudly. I hate to say church, but church is probably, traditional church. I would go for online services. Um, you know, uh, Stores that are small, really try to, wear a mask, distance from others, um, take precautions to um, assume everyone is infected. Don't ride in a car with someone that you don't live with. Um, Things like that. Just really concentrate on enclosed spaces.
Definitely. That's good advice for everyone to follow.
Yes.
And so now we're going to go to our last, and thank you, Joanna, for explaining all this to us. I know that's been pretty helpful for me as well, but other people, may find this helpful as well.
Yes. Thank you.
Yep. And so now we're going to go on to the last segment we have, which is the Tennessee races. There's actually multiple interesting races, even though Tennessee is a deep red state at the presidential level. There are some interesting primaries going on. And Joe is here to kind of help explain some of what's going on.
Yeah, so Tennessee, like Eric said, obviously a very deep red state. It is not going to go blue at a statewide level anytime soon. People thought it could with the former governor, Philip Brazedin, running for senator in 2018, and he ended up losing by about 10.5 points. So Tennessee is just right now in a position where it is not going to go blue for a long time. And so we have a competitive Senate primary right now. But there's also Phil Rowe, the Republican who's in the very red Tennessee 1st District, is retiring this year. So we have a very wide open primary. I don't believe we've gotten any polling on that seat at all. So we have a very wide open primary that's about a week and a half away now.
And Tennessee 1 is the district that's been ancestrally Republican back to almost the Civil War in terms of this is the western or eastern Tennessee. These are the unionist areas that have had Republican sympathies for a very, very long time. Just to give you an idea how red this district is, there's not even a blue dog Democrat sort of thing here. It's very red.
Yeah, it's been consistent, which you don't see a lot of those remaining in America, but this is one of the very few that has been consistently one party at the congressional level for a very long time.
Yeah, it's not been controlled by a Democrat since the 1800s. That's what we're talking about here.
But so we're going to start with the Senate race. Obviously, the more highly publicized race of the two, because you have Bill Hagerty, who, if we were talking about this race even maybe 2 weeks ago, you would have expected he was going to be running away with it, because when he before he even officially announced, President Trump came out and endorsed Hagerty over Twitter. And then about 3 months ago, there was a poll that came out. He was leading his closest opponent, Dr. Manny Sefi. It was like 58-17 or something like that. So before really this month, we had kind of expected this to be a big rout for Hagerty. But obviously, 2 recent polls have shown this to be a race for Sefi. Dr. Manny Sefi, who is a Tennessee neurosurgeon who has funneled lots of his own money into this race. Sefi has certainly kind of surprised a lot of people, and he really got a huge help today. Manny Sethi got the endorsement of Senator Ted Cruz, who is certainly popular in sects of the party that are more widespread in a place like Tennessee, which is that more religious right group of politics. Certainly more popular in a place like Tennessee. So it's really interesting to see here is that Haggerty, who is again Trump endorsed, he's raised about $8 million in fundraising, is now really struggling to put away a guy who we all thought he had put away 2 months ago. So it's going to be really interesting. The latest poll by JMC showed it only about a 3-point deficit for Sethi. He was down 30 to 27, according to this poll, to Haggerty. So this is really a toss-up race going into the primary 2 weeks from now. And it's going to be later interesting to see because whoever comes out of it is basically the presumptive next senator from Tennessee. And you've got two guys who are kind of running on two very different platforms, each kind of trying to out-Trump the other. I believe it is Haggerty who is attacking Manny Sethi for a previous donation to Tom Perillo in 2008, I believe, while Sethi is attacking Haggerty for helping out Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012. So if you want to know how this Senate race is going, certainly interesting. And I can say I see a question here in the public chat. No, neither of these two people are QAnon candidates, at least to our knowledge. Neither of these two have any ties to QAnon or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So,
Kind of the divide here is really fascinating. Is that in theory, both of these candidates could be very moderate senators if you look at their background. Bill Haggerty, even though he's been endorsed by Trump and a lot of Trump world, he's also been endorsed by Nikki Haley, Mitch McConnell, Jeb Bush. He was a member of he supported Jeb Bush initially in 2016. Bill Haslam. And he also does have that background of, like, if you look at his issues on trade, for example, he put out a policy brief on moving manufacturing back from China, which in theory is a very populist issue, right? If you look at his document, his plan, the word tariff is not mentioned once in his document. His plan is corporate tax cuts. So even though he's running as a very Trumpy candidate, his positions aren't really extremely conservative, or at least very Trumpy. And Sethi also has a background very similar to, former Senator Bill Frist. He has a background in healthcare. He's an orthopedic surgeon. He's the director of Vanderbilt University's Orthopedic Institute for Health Policy. Very invested in healthcare as an issue. And he's been endorsed by the very conservative folks, Ted Cruz, Jim DeMint, Rand Paul, those sorts of people. But even though on paper, he's a healthcare professional, his website doesn't mention those high button issues, it's really becoming a campaign of who is more conservative out of these two candidates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, they're attacking each other for recent ties. Again, Haggerty attacking Sethi for a donation to Tom Perillo, Sethi attacking Haggerty for being connected to Mitt Romney of all the people to attack. So this is certainly that type of race that we're going into. It is going to be extremely close. It looks like it is going to be extremely close no matter what. And there is kind of this weird third option. George Flynn Jr. Has spent over $4.3 million of his own money on this race in this primary. He has not really been a candidate that has been mentioned a lot. He is someone who has not really appeared in that high echelon of polling. But it'll be interesting to see what his margin could be going into next Thursday, 2 Thursdays from now, 2 weeks from now. And so that's something just to watch. We have 3 candidates who have all raised over $4 million. They've all spent at least over $3.4 million, all on the Republican side. So it's going to be interesting the primary to watch. It has been a primary that has been very expensive because, again, in a state like Tennessee, this is the race. The primary, the GOP primary, is the race for these guys. So it does not surprise me to see all this money being spent. And I think the more important thing is, too, one, we've got another Ted Cruz, Donald Trump split in a likely very close primary. We saw this last time in the last primaries in Texas, in Texas 23, between Tony Gonzalez and Raul Reyes. Trump had endorsed Gonzalez, Cruz had endorsed Reyes. And now we see it again where Trump has endorsed Haggerty, but Cruz has endorsed Sethi. And 2, it's going to be really interesting to see whether we kind of can see this crumbling of Trump's endorsement strength, where his endorsement seems to not really have as much weight as we thought it once was. He has seen some very certain losses, kind of starting with Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina 11, almost about a month ago now.
Mhm.
Since Cawthorn beat the Trump-endorsed candidate in that GOP special election primary, it's kind of, we've seen multiple other Trump-endorsed candidates lose in races. So it'll be interesting to see how that holds up.
Yeah, and another dynamic here is that Sethi is substantially younger. He's only in his 40s, whereas Haggerty is 60 years old. That's a similar profile to what you had with previous Tennessee Republicans, who have actually tended to be very high-profile national figures. So, for example, Howard Baker was in his 40s when he first won election. Bill Frist was in his 40s. And even those who haven't, for example, your Bob Corkers, your Lamar Alexanders, your Fred Thompsons, have all been very notable figures. So if that trend continues here, you may well be hearing either of these names in the future in a lot of Republican conversations. Just in the history of the state, it tends to produce very prominent figures. Someone like Sethi could easily become a leadership candidate in a couple of decades because he'd almost by default, because he'd be in his 60s and had been there for quite a while. So I don't know if anyone else has any other questions on this race. It is fascinating to me as a Republican to see kind of just the dynamics are very strange in this race, to say the least.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I'm going to move on now to the other competitive GOP primary. Like we mentioned, Tennessee's 1st district. The current incumbent Congressman Phil Rowe is retiring. This is an R+28 district. This is a very red district. It will stay red. And of course, when you're in these type of districts with these primaries, we have very busy primaries. So we have about 5 candidates who have all raised over $300,000 in this race for the Republican side. Diana Harshbarger, Josh Gap, John Clark, Rusty Crowe, and Steve Darden. All 5 of those candidates have raised at least over $300,000. Gap and Harshbarger have all been the only ones to have raised over $500,000. And Harshbarger has actually raised over $1 million, and she has about $232,000 cash on hand, which is the most out of any of these candidates. And that's kind of an interesting dynamic because Harshbarger is another one of those candidates that we've seen be recognized by Elise Stefanik's EPAC. She has not officially endorsed Harshbarger yet, but she has put her on their Women to Watch list for 2020. So it'll be very interesting to see here. Harshbarger, who has raised the most money, who has spent the most money, but still also has the most cash on hand. This is the type of race where, this is the type of place where Republicans need women to win. It's not the swing seats. It's not the races where they might lose or be in danger. If you want to start building up the number of women in your party, it's got to be safe states like these. So certainly Harshbarger is one you're going to want to watch. Josh Gap and Rusty Crowe are also the other 2 I'm watching right here. Crowe is a current state senator from the district, so he has that local connection. Gap has raised a lot of money. He's also spent a lot of money. Again, he's he's spent the most money behind Harshbarger again. So yeah, it's gonna be really interesting to see kind of, again, this race. Unlike the Tennessee Senate race, we haven't seen a lot of polling behind it. There hasn't been a lot of interest in it. So this is kind of one of those races where we're gonna go into it we're not gonna know much going into it, going into pretty blind when we go to Tennessee's election night 2 weeks from now. So, it'll be interesting to see kind of where the divide lays here, how these candidates match up. And it'll be really interesting to see if Tennessee can kind of get another female into Congress, because obviously Marsha Blackburn got promoted to the Senate. They lost another one who retired, Diane Black, who retired in 2018. So this would put another woman from Tennessee, who a Republican, into Congress. And again, kind of that focus on the safe seats is where it needs to be for the safe seats, for them to kind of increase the number of women in Congress who are Republicans for them. So that's really going to be kind of the key dynamic I think we're going to be watching here is, can Republicans nominate and get a woman in a safe seat who has money, has shown she can raise money? Can they do it? I think that's kind of going to be the storyline when we go into it 2 weeks from now.
And it doesn't get any redder than this seat, right? I mean, this is a seat that Donald Trump won 77-20, and it hasn't had a Democrat represent it since 1881. So again, it doesn't get any redder than this.
Absolutely. So yeah, this is one of the strongest red seats in the entire country. So it's just, well, again, like the Senate race, the primary is the basically the de facto general, especially in such a localized congressional race like this, where Donald Trump will not lose by any, or it won't even be close to Joe Biden by any margin. So it's just one of those races where we're going in blind to a primary. I wish someone would poll this primary race. Honestly, I would love to see a primary poll of this, in the next week and a half before, so maybe we don't go into it blind. But right now we are going into it blind. It'll be interesting to see what people see about this. Again, it's just going to be a very close race, and I don't think we're going to see anyone get probably over like 35% of the vote with how many Republican candidates are on the ballot.
Yeah. We're going to keep an eye on this race with Elections Daily, of course. We'll keep you updated on the results. One other tidbit before we kind of move on from that is that I found this kind of fascinating, is the Republican who represented the district when Tennessee attempted to secede from the Union was actually arrested on his way to Washington, D.C. after he during the Civil War. So he won re-election and was trying to go to D.C., but he was arrested en route, and that caused some tension, of course. But these sorts of districts are places where Republicans have really been pushing to get women candidates elected, and this is kind of a test of that, especially in such a crowded field. It's not as hard as when you have 1-on-2. In this case, you might only need 35% of the vote to be able to pull it off.
Yep, exactly. Just we've seen similar situations in I think New York, the seat New York, I believe 15, where Richie Torres is the considered Democratic nominee. I don't believe he's gotten over 31% in that race. It's this Tennessee's first district is a seat that's not nearly as red as that, for sure, but is kind of along that similar dynamics, and it has a lot of Republican candidates in it. It's going to be a lot of votes in it, and so we're going to see, no one's going to get a majority in this race unless something very shocking happens that no one really expected to see.
Yeah, and in response to the comment here, someone asked what he was arrested for. Well, he was arrested for opposing the Confederate government. He was basically released when he agreed to keep quiet about because 4 of Tennessee's 9 representatives, or 4 of the representatives in Congress, did not step down when the state seceded because of that sympathy in the East for the Union. But with that, I think we'll go ahead and close off tonight's episode. Thanks to everyone for being here, Joanna, Andrew, Peter, and Joe. You can find their Twitter handles in the show notes. And and if you like the episode, definitely be sure to like it, whether you're listening to this on YouTube or through your podcast provider. Leave a comment, subscribe to the YouTube channel or to the podcast provider. We definitely appreciate your support and your feedback. And so thanks to everyone for being on, and we'll see you next week.